Next up in our speaker series is one of our own, Sam Debuse, who's going to be working, he's an intern working with us, but he's going to be working on and presenting a whole interesting talk on a couple of different topics, but the main theme is, how are we going to look at measuring and making sure that we're creating the right kinds of outcomes. So Sam, thank you so much, and take it away. And I'm going to make sure you are, yes. Okay, great.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm not sure where everyone is located, and the global conference nature of this means that it might not be afternoon where you are, but it is where I am, here in Austin, Texas. My name's Sam Debuse, and as Luke said, I'm a summer intern and analyst at FirstRoot. And what I'm going to be talking to you about today is impact at FirstRoot. And interestingly, I actually just added "and investment" to the title. It was a very late change. And it was because when I was going through my presentation, I realized that what I really want to talk about is the relationship between investment and impact, which I think is at the core of what FirstRoot is doing. So a little bit of an introduction to my journey and how I ended up here. I call it a journey in impact. And admittedly, impact wasn't even a word in my vocabulary when I was 18, not at all. And I think that's partially because of what we're talking about, that it's lacking in education curriculum before people have an opportunity to go and learn about what impact means, either, through non-school networks or school or through their careers. But now it is first, it's sort of the priority of what I look at and what I'm interested in. And I say at the top that all roads lead to FirstRoot, and I'll explain why. So at the moment, I'm a master's candidate in public affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, where I focus pretty much exclusively on political economy and economics. I do sit, a couple of other classes beyond that, but that's my elective focus and it's my core interest set. Prior to studying at the University of Texas, I studied at Cornell University and the University of New South Wales, where I studied broadly similar things and foundational topics for public policy like international relations, finance, and economics. But between my undergraduate degree and my current degree, I worked for two firms. The first firm was called Massive Interactive. It was acquired by a firm called Delta Trade in 2018 during my tenure. And it was my first job out of school. And I had a wonderful exposure to agile and design thinking and product development. Massive was a fairly successful app development organization. And whilst I was inspired by the efficacy of these ways of working that I was being exposed to and the problem solving, sort of the creative problem solving nature of them, the subject of the problems that they were solving for weren't resonating with me. And I realized that what I wanted to do was move into a space where people who were, creative problem solving for social problems. And so I applied to the University of Texas to this program, but I ended up having a year and a half on my hands where I moved back to Sydney from London where I was working for Massive. And I was very fortunate to join what is now called Beckon Capital, but at the time was called the Nexus Initiative, which was a startup impact investment fund. And I worked for Chris Self as the CEO and founder at Beckon, who gave an incredible talk earlier on in this conference. And I highly recommend that you watch it if you weren't able to attend live. And Chris is, a genius who just blows my mind every time he talks about impact investing and economics. But whilst I was working at Beckon, I was working on sort of two streams. And the first was the more traditional investment stream, where we're looking at, the risk profiles and the profitability of some of the investment situations. But on the other side, the thing that really caught my attention was impact measurement and impact strategies and high impact strategies and what the difference between those things were. So that's why I've put, sort of these two things around FirstRoot, because I truly believe that FirstRoot is the intersect of those three things. It is, the first culmination of some of my journey, in that I say that FirstRoot is a high impact and an impact investment firm. And this is what we're doing. We're figuring out an impact strategy to support that. It is founded by and run by Agilist design thinkers and product development experts who crucially have understood that the ways of working and the knowledge and skill sets that they had, which have traditionally been siloed and isolated to private, software and product development companies, have profound social applications and are using these ways of working to produce wonderful social outcomes. And then the fact that FirstRoot really, in my mind, is a response to profound policy gaps and policy failures in the provision of funding, education, and civics. So a slightly different way of thinking about this, but I'm trying to map this to my experience in FirstRoot, is that I'm interested in understanding impact and investment decision rules and how these rules are either similar or different, and what we can do about the similarities and differences between public, private, and social sectors. So in my research at school, I mostly focus on the expenditure of government, public financial management, and the efficacy of services. And one of the things that I'm going to talk to you about today is how not the government has tried to and failed to integrate impact metrics in understanding its efficacy and its performance. That's one bucket. On the other side, we have the social sector, where I say that, basically impact can be synonymous with its core organizational objectives and its KPIs. And then the third bucket down the bottom is private. And I note here that when I talk about private, I'm really talking about not the entire private sector, but just impact investment firms or any organization that's involved in the use of money for the solution of social or environmental problems. And I have two statements here. The first is profit through impact, and the second is co-organizing principles. And I've borrowed profit through impact from the talk that Chris gave earlier in the conference, because I think it has wonderful explanatory power of what FirstRoot is and what FirstRoot is trying to do. And what Chris said, and I'm just going to quickly reference something that he said, is that really when you think about impact and you think about investment, there have been 3 stages in its evolution. And stage 1 is when there was a perception of a necessary trade-off between impact and profit. Version 2 was there's not necessarily a trade-off and sometimes they can work together. But version 3, Impact 3.0, which is where we're at now, is that actually impact drives profit, and that successful design of organizations and activities can make profit and impact mutually reinforcing when you have them as co-organizing principles. And that's what FirstRoot is. It's designed to be a profit through impact organization and a benefit corporation. And I'd like to just make the point that I'm matching in a very basic way, FirstRoot at the center and impact at the center, and my experience really in understanding public, private and social and private ways of raising money and spending money, and what the dynamics of investment and money and impact really are in these various ways. So what am I going to talk to you about today after a slightly long-winded introduction to why I'm interested in this stuff? I was thinking about whether I should deep dive into an impact strategy, but I realized that I had so many questions about, how we can go about this and things I wanted to ask other people and research first, that instead of providing a full and comprehensive impact strategy, I'm just going to talk about 3 almost completely distinct things. The first are 2 phenomena that I find super interesting about the role of impact in decision-making, with a particular focus on the public policy level, and which is my research interest at school. The second thing is an introduction to 2 bare bones theoretical frameworks for measurement and strategy from FirstRoot's perspective. So, really narrowing it down to what would a benefit corporation be looking at. And then finally, the third thing is a very simple assessment of the various modes and activities at FirstRoot that make it a high impact and comprehensive impact investment organization. So the first topic is just 2 things that interest me about impact. The first thing is that it's difficult to define. right? So apart from a very vague definition of positive change where there's reasonable consensus, what I've realized is that when you talk to different groups of people who are associated with different groups of people who are trying to achieve different things and they're using different means to achieve those things, they all have a substantively different understanding of what impact means, how to go about affecting positive impact, and how to measure that impact. And so if we think about a basic categorization and fracturing of the various agents in impact activities, we can say we have public, private, and social, which is an oversimplification, but for the sake of this presentation, we'll keep it at that. And then we have different levels of agency, which require different impact analysis. So we have individual, then we have community, and then we have macro, or tending towards sort of the aggregate, right? And then in each of these different buckets, in each of these different fractures, we have different definitions, different conceptualizations, different ways of measuring. And what happens is that comparative analysis of the effects of different types of activities, even when they are trying to achieve broadly the same thing, are really difficult. And because of these different measurement strategies, and because of these different definitions and conceptualizations, there is a profound barrier to collaboration and cooperation in public, private, and social partnerships. So as a representation of what this really means, I intend these three institutions below to be representative. The Global Impact Investing Network, the GIN, produces a wonderful report on impact measurement for impact investment in financial institutions. Now, of course, they focus on data strategies through the lens of how do we understand this in its association with profit centers? And how do we communicate these data types on impact to investors? Now, the impact that they're trying to achieve might be similar to policymakers in, say, OECD countries. But the way that they frame impact and the way that they measure impact and the purpose of their impact analysis is different enough that they're not communicating to each other effectively. And the same goes for, say, Doctors Without Borders. The relationship between their means, what they're trying to achieve, and how they then go about measuring their organizational objectives and KPIs and impact terms are again different. And what we know, and what I've learned from Luke, is that when we're talking about, as Luke, refers to as wicked social and environmental problems, we can't allow public, private, and social institutions to operate in isolated and siloed ways, because it's only through collaboration and cooperation that we're going to be able to face some of these existential threats. And so the point of this slide, and the thing I find interesting, is that there is a language and conceptualization problem, which is a direct barrier to the cooperation that we need to go about solving for some of these issues. The second thing I'd like to talk about is the relationship, what I call the relationship between government and people, and the relationship between FirstRoot and people, where the intersection in the middle is really people and impact, right? And so what I say is that whilst there is a net positive trend towards impact, and then by extension, inclusion and equity metrics being used to guide public policy, it is far too slow and it's not being done effectively. So I think the first point on this slide is unlikely to produce any, whoa. I think that people generally agree that traditional economic indicators like GDP completely fail to capture the true relationship between economic performance and lived experience. And what we know about impact and what we know about understanding the particulars of situations is that it's actually about understanding the individual moving towards the community, moving towards the aggregate. So what I mean by that is that it is a trickle out and trickle up phenomena, not a linear top-down policy thing like it is now, right? And so this is one of the massive issues. We're understanding parameters and indicators of performance, and we're understanding impact metrics in public policy space in the aggregate, when we have to be understanding it in localized situations. The second point I want to make about public policy and impact metrics is that institutions like the Sustainable Development Goals and happiness indices, as representative of a much broader and increasingly robust set of ways of understanding impact, positive trends, but they still are macro aggregate measures, and they're not really being used to drive policy decisions. There isn't an institutional incentive structure that is effectively causing policymakers to use these things in their decision making. And so I think what has happened is what I call a conflation and confusion between the true parameters of an economy and the economic indicators that are used almost exclusively to the exclusion of others by policymakers, and how that is basically perpetuated almost the fetishism with the complete wrong indicators of performance. And as a sort of analogous thing, when Luke talks about the use of stock market simulations as financial literacy, well, the issue is that it's representative of the same thing. We're not teaching financial literacy, and we're not teaching civics in terms of how they actually affect the operation of the system and your engagement with the system. We're talking about it in terms of, gamed simulations of stock markets, which are then used to understand economic performance by policymakers, which has zero direct relationship between the lived experience of people at an individual level. And I'm just going to quickly explain the difference between a parameter and an indicator as I see it, because it might be a little bit confusing. And statisticians might completely disagree with me here. But I say that a parameter is a characteristic of a system which defines its operation. And an indicator is a static snapshot of the collective performance of those parameters in a single way. And what's happened is that whilst a parameter and an indicator can be the same thing like currency, policymakers look at what they think are exclusively economic indicators, and by the very nature of the relationship between a parameter and an indicator, do take into account these parameters, but fail to recognize that they're doing so, and so fail to include them in effective ways in their policy decisions. And so for me, this is what FirstRoot is doing. FirstRoot is recognizing that, let's just take the US, right, as our example. We want a functioning democratic capitalist society, according to, the current policy set. There are some fundamental neglected parameters that we're not taking into account when we look at performance, and those are financial literacy and civics. And so the intersect between FirstRoot and government at the people level is that FirstRoot is providing tools to improve the true parameters of the successful operation of the system. And what an impact strategy is in relation to all of this is figuring out what are the indicators that we can use to prove that these are the parameters that improve the operation of the thing. I know that's quite a lot to take in, but that's sort of my high level criticism of the relationship between impact metrics and economic performance and policy. So moving on to a totally distinct a set of ideas. And this is, I think, sort of the core of what I was originally going to talk about, which is just impact measurement theories and applications from the lens of FirstRoot. So now we're talking about benefit corporations. So I'm going to look at two different ways of understanding how you can go about establishing the relationships between these parameters and between these indicators to prove the model. So method one is this basic impact measurement framework, and it's reliant on selected metrics and data collection. And this is a framework, this is the bare bones of a framework that I came across in a class called Managing Social Innovation. And I thought we applied it to various social enterprise situations, and I thought it did a very good job of both identifying the barriers that you have, but also the issue in the first place of what occurs in impact measurement. So FirstRoot is interested in an impact strategy that takes into account two things, and we call them outputs and we call them outcomes, right? And outputs are the things that you can control for through the activities that you engage in. So at a very basic level, our output is going to be through our participatory budgeting platform. But then what we want to see, which is our mission and our vision in the world, is, let's just take this sentence, a financially literate and civically engaged functional democratic society. So what are the metrics that we need to look at so that we can establish a relationship between these outputs that we have greater control over and are closer to, the time, time equals, approximately zero, versus down the line, or we call this downstream, what needs to happen in the middle. And this is an impact measurement strategy, and it's something that we're going to build out. And what happens at a statistical level and at a data level is that as T increases, as time increases, and as the coefficient, it actually decreases. This isn't a particularly good assessment of it here. But as the coefficient or the control level decreases, what is called the R squared of FirstRoot outputs decreases. And it doesn't necessarily, but statistically, because there is more involvement of alternative variables, the explanation that we can create between what we do and what we're trying to achieve as outcomes of these programs decreases. And so one of the issues with using exclusively this is that we basically are just saying this is a statistical problem. And what I would, excited about with the second method of an impact measurement strategy is that we can also build models that we can control for and we can continue to control for. And this is called a theory of change. And you might be familiar with it. And I've read quite a bit about theories of change, and this is not exactly what the folks who, first came up with the theory of change might, describe it as, but this is how I see it. The difference between this method and the first is that you continue to engage in activities to prove out the impact strategy that you've adopted. And the way that you do that is through establishing relationships and alliances as partners. You engage in a new set of activities, and then you come up with the assumptions of the effects of all of this, and you build an ecosystem so that you can prove the model between your outputs over here on the left, which is essentially participatory budgeting for FirstRoot, and the change that you're trying to see in the world. So I've deliberately left this, as blank as possible, because I invite you to think about what sorts of relationships and activities and assumptions we need to make so that we can create a provable relationship between the output of participatory budgeting and the change that we're trying to see in the world. Now, establishing a theory of change, I might add, is usually something that you co-design with people at a grassroots level. It's a very resource-intense process, but I think it's a fantastic process to be able to make sure that what you're doing is affecting positive change and affecting impact. So the third thing I'd like to talk to you about is how I understand FirstRoot as being a high impact and a comprehensive impact investment organization. And before I go to the next slide, because there are a few things going on, I think I want to say that, traditionally, impact investment has been a concept associated with, purely financial institutions who are then taking into account impact in their decision-making. Well, FirstRoot is not, a pure financial institution. So it's a little bit different, but these are the various modes and activities that we engage in that make us an impact investment organization. So on the far left, we have strategic investment partners. In a simple sense, as the recipient of impact investment dollars, the management entity of FirstRoot is engaged in impact investment. And in the establishment of those relationships and what they mean in terms of active investing, we have an impact investment sort of mode. The next piece, which I think is the most important, is our core activity and our users, the youth and the students who get to use these participatory budgeting programs to learn. And this is the most direct and democratic form of impact investing that exists, right? The next piece, which I find fascinating and which Luke talks to quite a bit, is that students who graduate through these PB programs become impact investment minded, such that their decision making on the other side can be called impact investment, right? And so Luke, even yesterday, said, wouldn't it be wonderful if we were able to take a student at the elementary level, then at the middle school level and the high school level, through 3 touches of participatory budgeting, and demonstrate what it's like to be involved in an impact investment situation, and for that alumni to then become an impact investor and invest in future PB cycles. Now that's called a self-sufficient and sustainable impact investment fund flow, and it's fantastic. The 4th point here is inclusion, equity, and partners. So we've established something called the FirstRoot School Fund, and it's a fund through which we can intake dollars from a variety of sources, but we, imagine it's corporate social responsibility programs, philanthropic organizations, charitable donations, etc. And this is where FirstRoot has a fantastic opportunity to maximize its impact. Because one of the things that we know is that when it comes to financial literacy and civics, not every student body and not every student is in the same situation. And whilst it's not always the case, some of the research that I've been made aware of suggests that at higher income schools, students tend to learn basic financial literacy and civics through their non-school networks. And at lower income schools, it is less true. And so where we have the opportunity to maximize impact is to co-design the distribution of the FirstRoot School Fund so that it's going to the students whose lives it can improve the most. The 5th part of impact investing at FirstRoot is FirstRoot becoming an impact investment fund manager. So one of the things that we're looking at doing is taking what is effectively the leftover sum after a PB cycle has concluded and investing it on behalf of the group that was engaged in the PB cycle. Now, this is an opportunity for us to use capital to become an impact investment fund. The last piece of this puzzle with impact investing is in public-private partnerships. And as I was saying before at the beginning of this talk, one of the issues is that organizations aren't recognizing the need to go beyond just having a basic conversation and actually act as a bridge for the conceptualization, the definition, and the activity of impact-related stuff. And so we're looking into social impact and microbonds. And the way that these work is that government entities in the money bond markets don't want to assume the risk of, more bleeding edge and innovative solutions to social environmental problems. They don't want to assume the risk. So they push the risk onto private organizations like FirstRoot, who can issue debt-related instruments to private markets. But if FirstRoot hits the performance metrics, government will pay it back. So government offshores the risk, but FirstRoot is able to raise funds for PB cycles and act as an impact investor in that regard. And so when we talk about an impact strategy to support all of these things, it's about the methods for improving and proving these impact investment activities. And this is going to be a constantly evolving process. But I wanted to explain how the financial flows and their relationship with impact are really at the core of everything that FirstRoot does. So for a slight recap, we covered that impact is hard to define and it causes collaborative and cooperative barriers. We covered that policymakers aren't using the right parameters to drive decisions and they don't have the right indicators either. And we covered that benefit corporations and impact-oriented private organizations like FirstRoot are needed to pick up the slack and bridge these different sectors. Then we looked at impact measurement and how it takes many forms. At FirstRoot, we're interested in establishing the relationship between outputs and outcomes, either through a clever data strategy and metrics, or through building relationships and alliances and engaging in the activities to continue to prove out the model. But basically, it's longitudinal studies and a theory of change. And then finally, we explored how FirstRoot is fundamentally and by design a high impact and impact investment benefit corporation. That's pretty much it for today. Thank you for listening to me. I know it dealt with some slightly disjointed things, but it was a wonderful opportunity for me to talk about some of the stuff that I'm most passionate about. So I'm appreciative of that.
Yay. That was amazing. That was just, that was stunning in goodness. And what I think is really compelling is the conscious design that we're trying to put into this. One of the things that I'd like you to go back and talk about, if you could, is the theory of social change structure, and the kind of concern that I have about just to tease that out a little bit, because one of the concerns is, in terms of the relationships and alliances and activities and assumption of effects, there's a gentleman, Eric Mead, who wrote a book, Reframing Poverty. And in his model, humans are like pegs in a plinko board. And as you slot, as your token drops down the board, the pegs knock you around in a semi-random way. But his model is extended in the way of, imagine that a person is a peg on the plinko board. And when you hit that person, they actually absorb you and shoot you out a certain way. And that could be equivalent to the relationship and alliance. But I think that one of the assumptions of effects that is about this theory of change that's so important is the individual choices we make, but the individual choices we make in the context of the system that we're within. And because we know that minority students and minorities just don't have the same system, and yet we do know that there's relationships and alliances that are both macroeconomic and microeconomic. So my question to you is specifically this. Previously in the side deck, you talked about the time variable in the conversion of output to outcome. Does that graph there, like in a kind of a mental model, do you shrink that and stick that in the middle of the theory of change? Meaning, what's the relationship between this 2x2 and then go forward 2 slides or that 1 slide, and that middle diagram of participatory budgeting, and then the outcome of a financially literate and civically engaged functional democratic society? It seems to be that 2x2 in this picture somehow should go together in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I realized actually that I took away part of the title, and I'm not sure why I did, of this previous here slide. I actually first called this slide Where I First Started. And it was my first introduction to impact measurement. And I think you've hit the nail on the head, which is that this is part of this. And the difference between the two is that by engaging in a theory of change and building the relationships and alliances and activities, you're not reliant on, for example, in the first instance, other people's data and other people's collection. You're actually actively engaged in co-designing and collecting those data, right? You're building the relationships, say, between the difference, you mentioned the difference between a lower income or say a higher income school, and how the ecosystem and the environment they operate in are fundamentally different. That's right. So this framework doesn't differentiate enough between the particulars of different mini ecosystems within the broader system. And so this is really what I meant to say in this presentation, is that whilst this is important and we need to select the metrics and we need to have a data strategy and we need to collect some data and we need to, consider the strength of the relationship between our outputs and our outcomes, really we need the 2x2 to be part of a theory of change. And what this does is it allows us to actually act upon the insights that we get from the previous, from the 2x2. So like, let's say, to your point, we recognize that lower income schools are unlikely to operate a swim club, and a higher income school might operate a swim club. Now, that swim club is representative of whether or not the school runs clubs at all, means that the way that we engage with the schools and the way that we engage with the students might be different. Now, that probably produces a different effect in what we're going to try to measure. Because if we attach this to a particular curriculum for a school and then we attach it to a club, the kick-on, the outcomes, they will be different. It's a different type of engagement. And so this just allows you to go, the theory of change allows you to go significantly wider and to factor in the differences in the way that we engage, but then to make sure that we're able to actually, work with people to understand what those differences are.
Okay.
I mean, I when I was at Beckon, I produced a very high level theoretical theory of change for them. And I presented it and we went, whoa, this is pretty cool. And then I started looking more into theories of change, and I realized that actually it's, large teams over the period of, a period of a year or two, slowly teasing out and testing out the theory of change, rather than sitting, in front of a laptop saying, this probably means this, and we could probably go out and build this. So
Right.
it is a continuously evolving operational approach to impact measurement and strategy.
Got it. And I mean, I think the outcome that we're looking for at the far right is, what's interesting is that given where we are as a company, and given where we are with our theories and the data that we have, or such that we have, it's kind of exciting to look at that result and say, we still don't have to have everything about how we produce that result figured out. Because that's part of a startup's job, is to kind of go from where we are to that goal. And when we recognize, earlier with the Pockets Change team, they showed that graph of, well, you think it's linear, but it's really this kind of squiggle, and the squiggle can be kind of ugly. That's pretty important stuff.
No, absolutely. And if you think about it, right, government is almost the opposite of a startup, and government hasn't figured out, too much of what I was talking about. Government hasn't figured out what these metrics are effectively, and what the relationship between outputs and outcomes are. And government doesn't know what its real theory of change is, and absolutely what I'm talking about. If we can figure this out, you've solved one of the biggest issues in data collection and impact strategy that exists, right? So this isn't, intended to be representative of what FirstRoot, should or ought to or is going to engage in the immediate term. It was more an exploration of what frameworks are identified as being, as needing solution.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's also an opportunity for us to look at that end game and look at the data that we generate in terms of those results. I think that one of the problems is that we still have too many systems out there where if a positive impact occurred, we don't know why. And if a negative impact occurred, we don't know why. And therefore, it's hard to determine, whether the impact was through your intervention or through some other mechanism.
Right. And yeah, and so it's also, I think, what's going to be really interesting is to figure out what are the set of reasonable assumptions that we can make.
Right.
We don't need to try to test in the near term, and which ones are really super crucial, so we can make sure that we're maximizing our impact with our activities.
Right. Very inspiring for me. Although this is among the sessions that we've had in the conference that are a little bit more, I'd say, technical in nature. Based on this work and based on what we're doing now, do you think that in terms of the design of the company, there's anything like, did you discover anything that's missing? Anything that's like, whoa, there's this really big hole and it's all going to fall apart if we don't think this through?
Yeah, let me just pull up my screen again, actually.
You were supposed to say no, we're all set. If it is yes, then I'd rather know now.
Look, I would have thought, I've only been with you for a month, but I would have thought that you knew that I was a bit more honest than that.
Of course. No, I'm kidding.
I suppose, and we've already discussed this, there is, and this feeds into the impact measurement stuff. There is some of our activities, which are just our core activities, and we design them around producing the best effect given the subject of what we're trying to achieve, where what we're trying to achieve is not necessarily, impact, inclusion, and equity driven impact investing. So like over here, although I've called, the core activity, although I've called PB the most direct and democratic form of impact investing, the way we go about designing for PB is not purely through an impact investment lens. So those sorts of areas, I don't think, really require at this point serious attention in terms of the relationship between investment and impact from that lens. Over here, really, this is where FirstRoot and partners, and this is, I think really crucially, and partners have the opportunity to co-design the performance metrics of the FirstRoot School Fund. What is it that is interesting, and what is it that philanthropic dollars are seeking in terms of impact return on investment? How do we use those conversations to co-design our understanding of impact and investment? And I mean, that's really, the thing that I'm most interested in is, what is our categorization, what is our selection, and what is our engagement model with partners, so that we're at a grassroots level co-designing this impact investment strategy.
So it's interesting that you're talking about the partners. I think of the partners as the people who would fund the FirstRoot School Fund.
Right.
What's your language about the recipients of the FirstRoot School Fund?
So this is sort of the inclusion and equity piece. And to be perfectly frank, I had a slide about inclusion and equity and maximization of impact. And to be perfect, I'll be candid. The reason I didn't include the slide was that I couldn't quite figure out how to language the difficult balance between the belief that PB is a great, if not the best way to deliver financial literacy and civics. So we assume that both of those things are really positive, and wanting to literally have every student and youth in the world use PB to learn these things, but also being cognizant of the fact that there is a significant journey to get there, and decisions are made throughout that journey where we can fork in the road, towards either focusing on the provision of funds to lower income schools, where we say the relative return on impact is probably greater, or, a blanket approach to whichever school will work with us in the short term. And, so I couldn't quite figure out how to language that, because I'm still not sure of what those rules would be. But I think that, so when we talk about the recipient of the FirstRoot School Fund, I think that it's really important that we view it through an inclusion and equity lens, and that we are taking into consideration the differences between who those recipients are beyond it just being students.
Right.
And I think that is the highest impact investment and impact strategy that we can possibly have.
So I don't know if Rebecca Gallagher is still with us, but Rebecca, if you are, okay, you just made a comment, which is really great. is there so this is for Rebecca Gallagher, if you're
I'm
still
on. I'm on. I
Okay,
am still with you. Yes.
So when you look at the FirstRoot School Fund, right, which is our
Mhm.
our intention in the FirstRoot School Fund is to help kickstart participatory budgeting programs in schools that need a little help. And we just make flat out donations, but we make those donations to the school under the same guidelines that we would expect the school to operate, meaning we don't control the funds, but neither does the school. The students are in control. What would you expect, given your experience as an educator and also as a leader of the Jumpstart Coalition in California, that would be the kind of considerations or parameters that would promote the principles of inclusion and fairness and equity that Sam presented?
Well, I guess I would say, what is a good model that you have for that right now, where participatory budgeting is actually happening in a program that serves as a good model for that?
Well, we have schools doing PB, but I don't know if there's any programs out there that have the same objective that we do about the PB process. I mean, meaning I don't know, Sam, have you found any programs that are out there that say, we want to fund PB programs in schools?
No, Luke, the closest really, and this is the, I suppose the major difference is that I've spoken to some educators who have used what is effectively a version of PB for hands-on sort of project-based work, but they are all simulations, and there's no relationship that I've come across between existing, funds to support what would effectively be a program budget and these programs. They're all theories. They're theory-based programs, which are then run like a project in a simulation way.
Yeah, that's my, and I'm generally cautious about simulations. My rule of thumb is I'd rather not simulate. I don't want to simulate riding a bike. I want to ride a bike. So Rebecca, I'm going to try and get you to answer the question. What actual parameters would you advocate for? I mean, let's say there is no reference program and you've got a lot of experience as an educator. What kinds of, and I'll make it really concrete. We get $100,000 commitment from a corporate social responsibility partner, and they trust us to make those investments in schools to promote financial literacy through participatory budgeting. How do we pick which school gets what amount of money? Oh, you're muted.
I'm going to once again refer to the, see it through an equity lens and see it through an engagement lens. I think that would be what would be resonant to both investors and to schools is to actually, focus on school programs that have high levels of need. I think you're going to find, folks that are very interested in, again, re-engaging. I'm sorry to use that word so many times, but re-engaging kids that have been really disconnected in this last year, and maybe can generally be a little disconnected. Now, I'm not saying that can't be a big comprehensive high school. That certainly could be. But I think that would be a good place, and not a simulation, a very, getting the administrators to buy into an actual participatory budgeting plan for that, for a semester or for a year.
So again, I'm going to try and, maybe I'm not framing it correctly. If I have, I don't know, in the San Jose area, the larger San Jose area, inclusive of some of the smaller cities, ranging from Menlo Park and, Santa Clara and Sunnyvale and San Jose, there's probably maybe 300 high schools. And I've got $100,000. which high school gets what money?
I would aim at the largest comprehensive of them. That's what I would do. Because I think you're going to get, like, for instance, I remember I was on a review committee for Belmont High School, or no, in Belmont. It's a high school, big, huge, comprehensive high school. Carlton, I think, Carlmont High School in Belmont. And it was a perfect example of a big comprehensive school that had all manner of students, and programs addressing very specifically and very skillfully addressing needs of, kids performing at the highest academic levels and kids that were not, but giving quality programs throughout. Again, I was on an evaluation committee. So there's an example there, and they were a big high school.
Okay, great. So there's a couple of, so Sam, I hear that there's dimensions, there are attributes associated with the size that are relevant to our consideration, because of course size includes more kids by definition.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder, Rebecca, if I might ask you a question. One of the issues that was raised with me from an educator who works at the Title I charter school was that if we mostly or disproportionately work with schools that are middle or higher income, and we provide them with financial literacy and civics in an already, unequal world, is there an extent to which we are almost perpetuating existing inequality? Because the schools that are the easiest to work with are likely to also be the ones that have students who are already more privileged. Do you think that's a reasonable criticism?
Yeah, yes, I do. And that's why I'm suggesting, because that's been one of the criticisms of financial literacy outreach, that it often happens in alternative education programs or something like that. Again, harkening back to the old days of, dumbed down math and whatnot, right? So you want to be careful about that. And that's why I'm suggesting that maybe targets might initially be large, diverse, suburban or even urban schools that really represent a number of different student populations, and they're addressing it well.
Right. Brilliant. Well, does anyone have any questions that they want to throw at Sam other than me?
No.
All right. Well, Sam, thank you.